Before we get started, continuing with the Awakening of Faith, are there any questions? Something came up as you were... I'm sure everyone's read the book 3 times by now, and you're just right. It's all got little notations in the margins and everything. Okay. So we're doing this hybrid traditional style, going kind of line by line through the text, and we're still in the introductory portion. So we're still in the, these aren't even really the chapters yet. These are kind of the intros to the, forgot. Oh, that's better, right? These are the intros to the text itself. So we're still on the reason for writing. So this is Asvagosha discussing his purpose in writing the text. And so as I mentioned last time, his purpose is, and he states in the beginning, not for fame or renown, but rather to be of benefit to people. So we covered the first 3 reasons for writing. So those are there. So we're going to be moving on to the 4th. And if we have time tonight, we'll get into the next section where he goes a little bit more in depth on terms of the reason and purpose and kind of outline of the text. So he starts off with this is the reason for writing, and then goes into, this is what I'm going to talk about. So very common with any kind of scholarly work in that way. You're going to lay out for people, this is what I'm about to do, here's me doing it, okay, this is what I just did, this kind of style. So you'll see that a lot in this work. So he lists there the 3rd reason is to enable those whose capacity for goodness has attained maturity to keep firm hold upon a non-retrogressive faith in the teachings of the Mahayana. We probably will have time tonight. We're going to actually get to what he means by Mahayana. So it's not the typical definition. But this is one of the other reasons that he's writing the text is to, those people who've gotten, maybe they've dipped a toe into the water, they've gotten up to their ankles, they have some, they've made some progress, just to continue to help them along. So he's looking at people at all stages along the spiritual path. So we looked at sort of the meaning of faith in the first class, or second class, of this text. But this is one of the, I think, things personally that is a unanswered question for a lot of religious texts, is how do you actually develop faith? And then how do you nurture it? So a lot of times people just start off with the expectation that you have it, and that it's unwavering and there's nothing wrong with it. Or that it can't be broken or something like that. So Asvagosha, or in the Buddhist path, we're not assuming that this faith thing is this solid block of granite that is unchanging and unmoving. So he's clearly stating, as part of the reasons for writing, looking at people all along that continuum of what faith is and where they are in terms of working with it. So if we go down to the next section, the 4th reason is to encourage those whose capacity for goodness is still slight to cultivate the faithful mind. So from Asvagosha's perspective, explanation produces understanding, and understanding requires practice. Understanding alone is insufficient. So if we go back again to the definition of faith that we were working with, you're developing faith in your practice, so some practice has to be taught to you, right? You can't just say, have faith. You actually have to be told, okay, this is the method, practice it, and then based on your experience, you can develop faith in the benefit or the progress that you see from doing the practice. So you often hear me equate spiritual practice to, physical exercise. You will see results. It takes a little while though. And I think in the same way, if you do physical exercise, after 2 weeks, you'll see some results. Those 2 weeks will be not fun if you haven't exercised in a while. After you've gotten to the 2-week point, you may say, oh, I see some difference. I'm stronger, I'm standing straighter, something's different. And then, similarly, you have to keep going to see greater and greater effect, but you may not notice day to day the changes. It may only be evident when, you put on clothing and it doesn't fit any longer, either because you got, what's the term, you got swole, or because the opposite, right, you shrank. So it might not be noticeable, right away, but you might be like, oh, there's a new muscle right here. What is that? Or, my pants don't fit anymore. So one or the other. But day to day may not be that noticeable. Same thing, I think, with faith, or when you're doing practice. You say, like, I don't really see the benefit, but you have to have some idea that, like anything, it's going to take a little while to see progress. So that is a type of faith, right? Just that kind of logical knowledge that if I want to see some benefit, it's going to take a little bit. So that's one of the key pieces here. So he says, the fifth reason is to show them expedient means, upaya, by which they may wipe away the hindrance of evil karma, guard their minds well, free themselves from stupidity and arrogance, and escape from the net of heresy. I probably wouldn't have translated as stupidity. We typically use ignorance in Buddhist texts, and I always like to point out it's not a lack of knowledge, or it's not an IQ issue. It's that you're not seeing things clearly, or you're willfully disregarding evidence or truth. So that's what we mean here by that. Free themselves from that kind of thing. Arrogance and escape the net of heresy. The heresy, that's kind of a loaded word from Judeo-Christian tradition. I don't think we'd use that. It's convenient to use, we kind of understand, but what we don't want to do is we should be careful about how we present the teaching so that people don't end up slandering the Dharma inadvertently, right? So certain practices may not be good to do on a street corner because it would be easily misunderstood. Other practices may be appropriate because people have some knowledge or understanding of what they're attending. So, if I were to just go onto the light rail and start chanting, people would probably think I had mental illness, right? So it may not be, right, the expedient means, the upaya there. So we have to give consideration to the time, place, and manner of the practice we're doing, or how we present the teaching, so that is actually beneficial to people, right? Meeting them where they are. What do people need? If someone's doing something naughty, it may or may not be helpful to run up to them and say, you shouldn't do that. They may not be in the most receptive state of mind at the moment. So you may want to model the appropriate behavior rather than tell them, right? So they would see you go, oh, maybe I should do that instead. So that seems to be working better, and they gravitate naturally. So this upaya, this expedient means, is kind of looking for ways that we can be better teachers, that we can present things in a better way so that it's actually beneficial to people. So we don't want to just say, well, our method is the best, and I'm assured of that, so all I need to do is tell people what to do. We'd rather actually look at what are the needs of people and present a teaching to them that's helpful for them, that's actually going to be of help to them. So in this way, one of the reasons why one of the names for the Buddha is kind of the great physician. So understanding specifically what the ailment of the person is and presenting a teaching or a medicine that's most beneficial to them, right? So if you go, how many times you go to the doctor, they say, well, it's wrong. You say, oh, it's this old thing, it happens all the time, I just need more of whatever you gave me last time. And the doctor still says, well, no, we need to examine you and look at something and, make sure that that's really the issue. And if that hasn't worked in the past, maybe we should try this new thing, or they're sort of more expert than us non-doctors. So kind of the same way that the expedient means is actually sometimes also rendered skillful means, that you're looking for the most skillful way to assist people. And it may not be the most evident, or may not be your first choice as a way of helping people. So you really have to consider their situation. That also requires you to move out of what you want to do, right? So maybe the doctor's thinking, oh, the pharmaceutical rep was here yesterday and he gave me a whole bunch of this free meds. I got to get rid of this because it's taking up space in my closet. But is that really what the patient needs? In the same way, the spiritual teacher here, in this case, Asvagosha, has to consider a variety of different people. What do the people need? And provide them a benefit in that way. So I think probably before Asvagosha wrote this, he said, oh, I know this teaching. I know there are other people who don't have it. He spent time reflecting on what it is that the other people needed, and then he wrote this. So that's why he's saying these are the reasons why I'm writing. So it's, I think, with great reflection that he's presenting this text to us, and kind of pointing the way through all this other, Buddhist literature and things we could be studying. Okay. So the next few are pretty self-explanatory. So the sixth reason is to reveal to them the practice of the two methods of meditation, cessation of illusions, and clear observation, shamatha and vipassana. Ever heard of these two types of meditation, shamatha and vipassana? So usually you'll hear people talking about vipassana, and they will leave out shamatha. So they were actually meant to be practiced together. Vipassana has become very popular. That's like probably one of the second most famous buzzwords outside of Zen in the meditation community. So these are the two fundamental practices. So we have these in all schools of Buddhism. It's not limited to just those buildings that have the word Vipassana on the front, or retreats that have that title. These are skills developed in meditation that are the basis for all meditation. So all of us, all of the traditions have it. So there's to reveal to them those practices, cessation and clear observation, so that ordinary people and followers of the Hinayana may cure their minds of error. Like I said, we're going to get into the definitions of how these terms are used, Mahayana and Hinayana. I will say here, just keep that in mind. It'll be explained later. A lot of Western Buddhist literature is filled with kind of this tension, whether real or not, between the supposed Mahayana schools and Hinayana or Theravada schools. That's, in my opinion, study is largely not a real tension dynamic. Where it did exist was in, India, Nalanda University, where you had all of the schools and different schools of thought interacting sometimes in debate, within the same monastery or monastic complex. So once we get to East Asia, this is largely not a thing, right? So the seventh reason is to explain to them the expedient means of single-minded meditation, so that they may be born in the presence of the Buddha and keep their minds fixed on a non-retrogressive faith. What do you think it means to be born in the presence of the Buddha? Any guess? Yes, right? Maybe a Pure Land. It could be reborn literally at the time of a Buddha, or it could mean more metaphorically actually come into contact with the teaching. Right? So, I don't know about you, but I wasn't born in a place with Buddhist temples or teachers. So I had to make some effort to go find it, and said effort was like, move across the continent. So it required some movement, but every time I did some practice, it drew me into contact with other practitioners, and eventually you come into contact with the teaching you need, but you have to put some effort into it. But I think eventually you make those connections. So that's number 7. Then the 8th reason is to point out to them the advantage of studying this treatise and to encourage them to make an effort to attain enlightenment. These are the reasons for which I write this treatise. So also very self-explanatory, I think, right? So these are his reasons for writing, and he lays them out. Perhaps lest we doubt his motives, right? You ever wonder, you read something and you're like, who wrote this anyway? Why did they write it like this? Why are they presenting this information to me? So this is, the text is speaking to us more directly, which I kind of appreciate personally. So the text continues with question and answer. What need is there to repeat the explanation of the teachings when it's presented in detail in the sutras? Asagosha, why are you writing this book when everything we need to know is in the sutras? What's the point? Good question. So, though this teaching is presented in the sutras, the capacity and deeds of people today are no longer the same, nor are the conditions of their acceptance and comprehension. What do you think? Is that true? I'll give you an example, because I think it's true. An 8th grade education or high school education used to be, in many ways, equivalent to college degree now. And I found, talking to older people, many of whom aren't around anymore, that they learned a lot more in grade school and high school than we do today. So one of my professors in graduate school pointed out that we learn how to look things up, right? We learn where to go to find answers, but in the old days people actually memorized and really had to study more deeply the information. So it creates different types of learners. I think we need both skills, but maybe perhaps a little bit today, people are just learning where to go to get information. They don't actually have it at their fingertips. So for some professions, that's fine. Other professions, you need to know it. So a little bit different. That is to say, in the days when the Tathagata was in the world, people were of high aptitude, and the preacher excelled in his form, mind, and deeds, so that once he had preached with his perfect voice, different types of people all equally understood. Hence, there was no need for this kind of discourse. So there's 2 implied components here. One, those who had the karmic roots to be born at the time of the Buddha were ready to wake up. That's why they were born at that time. Right? They weren't sitting there going, can you repeat that again? I didn't get it. Right? They got it. That's why they were actually born at that time. The other benefit is the Buddha was better than anybody else at speaking the Dharma. I apologize. I'm not as good. Right? So this is what he's saying. That there was the best explainer. This person presented the material better than anyone currently alive could. And so everybody else listening has to suffer with lackluster lecturers. Right? So, and in addition, we don't have this karmic roots to be born at the time of Buddha. So we have to work harder than, we're still working to get to that point, whereas people born at the time of the Buddha had put more work in at that time. So we're a little bit behind. It's not a judgment, he's just pointing out. Let's see. But after the passing away of the Tathagata, there were some who were able to were able by their own power to listen extensively to others and to reach understanding. There were some who, by their own power, could listen to very little and yet understand much. There were some who, without a mental power of their own, depended upon the extensive discourse of others to obtain understanding. There were some who, by their own I lost my place. There were some who, without any mental power of their own, depended upon the extensive discourse of others. And naturally there were some who looked upon the wordiness of extensive discourses as troublesome, and who sought after what was comprehensive, terse, and yet contained much meaning. And then they were able to understand it. So, translation to modern education methods. We all learn differently, right? Any teacher will tell you that students learn differently. Some people need to learn, they want lecture, others want to read, other people want hands-on, other people, it's a trial and error type of learning system. Other people do well with group work, others don't. There's a variety of methods. So any good teacher, think back on your own education, there's a variety of different ways the material is presented to you. It wasn't just, here's the book, see you at the end of the semester, read it, right? It wasn't only, I'm going to lecture at you, and there's very few where the entire education was just group work or something like that. So you get a variety of different things. Temple educations like this, there's a lot of self-work, there's a lot of, a little bit of everything. A tremendous amount of self-work though. And then there's like secret group work where everybody, all the novices get together, what are we doing? I don't know. Let's find out, best guess. And then everybody sits there and gets scolded for doing the wrong thing, like, oh, we got it wrong, So, this is Asagosha's observation, right? There's all these different types of learning styles. Thus, this discourse is designed to embrace, in a general way, the limitless meaning of the vast and profound teaching of the Sagada. This discourse, therefore, should be presented. Right? There's a lot of different ways to learn. There's a lot of material. Synthesizing it is a help to people. So this is his purpose in writing. So we go into, it continues on. Let's see. Part 2, the outline. The reason for writing have been explained. Next, the outline will be given. Generally speaking, the Mahayana is to be expounded from 2 points of view. One is the principle, and the other is the significance. 3 sentences. That is the entire purpose of the book. Right there, especially the last sentence. One is the principle, and the other is the significance. Or the one mind with 2 aspects, as it's sometimes referred. Don't worry if you don't understand it after tonight. This is the entire purpose of the text, is explaining it in various ways and going in depth. So, as he pointed out, some of the material is terse. Some people like terse explanations, others don't. We'll explain it in a variety of different ways, but if it's not immediately evident after one evening, that's okay. Don't worry. We're going to come back around to the material a couple times. So, but this is the key component. This is what the Awakening of Faith is really known for. Translator's note here is very helpful. So everything in italics in this section is the notes of the translator, which you can see is most of it. There's only that 3 sentences for his outline. So this is all explanation. So it should be noted that the term Mahayana here is not used in the usual sense of the word, that is Mahayana versus Hinayana. According to the definition given in the discussion immediately following, Mahayana designates suchness or the absolute. The title of the text, The Awakening of Faith in Mahayana, should therefore be understood as the awakening of faith in the absolute, not in Mahayana Buddhism as distinguished from Hinayana Buddhism. So some people, we'll let the train pass. Yeah, some nights it's really fast, and other nights it's slow. I don't know. Oh, sorry. Did I go too far? Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. No, that's too far. We're here. I have to look this way. I should put it somewhere where we can all see. Another way to title the text, so the text is Awakening of Faith in Mahayana. It could be Awakening Mahayana Faith. So this could be one way to kind of retitle the book. So this is a key distinction. We're not talking about becoming a faithful Mahayanist versus a Hinayanist or something. So this is a kind of an important key in terms of what is meant by the two. So the principle is the mind of the sentient being. This mind includes in itself all states of being of the phenomenal world and the transcendental world. On the basis of this mind, the meanings of the Mahayana may be unfolded. Why? Because the absolute aspect of this mind represents the essence, svabha, of the Mahayana, and the phenomenal aspect of this mind indicates the evident essence, attributes, lakshana, and the influences, kriya, of the Mahayana itself. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff there. So we'll try to explain a little bit. So he starts off the previous section given these 8 reasons for writing the text and goes in depth. And then he gives this caveat of how to understand Mahayana. And it really bears kind of sinking in, because if you've done any reading in Buddhism, this Mahayana Hinayana dynamic is kind of everywhere. That's because those texts are written by Buddhist scholars, not Buddhist practitioners for the most part. That's a helpful background, but it's not something that's going to come up all the time for practitioners. So we're going to set that aside. As I said before, by the time we get to, Shingon is an East Asian Buddhist school. So by the time you get to China, Korea, Japan, this is largely an unknown dynamic because Mahayana Buddhism was the only form that was prevalent. So monks weren't running down to the borders of Southeast Asia saying, "You're getting it wrong." And it wasn't the dynamic that was going on. So he talks about these principles, svabha. So what does this mean? It means something's own nature, its essential nature. And in the case of the Mahayana, he'll explain it a little bit more in depth, but this is kind of the meaning. The lakshana, the attribute or quality, and the kriya, the influence. So he's starting the conversation of how do you break down the definition of Mahayana in this sense, and what is meant by that. So he says here the mind is discussed from 2 viewpoints, the absolute and the phenomenal. What does that mean? As for the absolute aspect, only essence is mentioned, but in the case of the phenomenal aspect, essence, attributes, and influences are listed. So, real title of this text, One Mind, Two Aspects. So this is the title. The essence is what we refer to as Buddha nature. So this is the key. So it says the mind has as its essence Buddha nature. This is a critical kind of worldview within Shingon, especially other Mahayana Buddhist schools, that whatever else we have going on, however we may behave, whatever's happening to us karmically, we still have Buddha nature. So this is a key component. So this is a core cosmological idea. The reason it's sort of core is, as a cosmology, what are we trying to do? Right? What's our end goal? Is it to go somewhere for benefit in the afterlife, or is it to fully actualize or realize what it means to be human? So that's incredibly important, is that are we looking outside of ourselves, or are we looking inside ourselves? That's an important component. Yeah, we're looking inside. And so we're saying that all things, including people that we temporarily label enemy, or we watch the news and say, oh, they're so annoying to us or something, they still have Buddha nature. So this is a kind of a fundamental idea within Buddhist ideas. So we're wrestling with the idea whether there is something to be attained outside ourselves, or whether everything, our essential Buddha nature, all the effects and manifestations of samsara, this dynamic of self and other, holy and profane, is that a real dynamic, or are we just getting it wrong? So, big cosmological question for Buddhist practitioners is what is spiritual practice actually? Are we obtaining something? Are we sitting here meditating, waiting for the Buddha to give us enlightenment? Or are we uncovering it? Are we trying to get rid of practices that are unhelpful to the spiritual path? Is the spiritual path something separate from our day-to-day life? Right? Where is it? What is it? We're drawing these distinctions all the time. So this consumes a lot of mental cycles, actually. Do we think there's a distinction between self and Buddha? Between ourself and the world? Between the individual and the universe? So this is this idea of one mind with two aspects. I know I've not given you any answers, I'm just posing questions. So the Buddha wakes up, right? He's awakened, the awakened one. He sits under the Bodhi tree, he wakes up. Has he gotten something from somewhere else? Or is he just suddenly seen more clearly? He's seen through his own self-made obstacles. Probably saw through his own self-made obstacles. So if we say the Buddha nature is already inside of us, it just needs to be revealed, then how do we explain all the other stuff that we do that's not helpful? Why are we still acting in a manner that is not revealing of our Buddha nature? Don't worry if you don't have an answer. This is the subject of all the sutras. Right? I do want to point out that if you see his footnote 37 there, so and the phenomenal aspect of this mind indicates the essence, attributes, and influences of the Mahayana itself. Footnotes are important. I'm going to read you the footnote because this one's important. So, this pattern of analysis in terms of essence, attribute, or manifestation, appearance, and the influence, or function and activity, is one of the great contributions that the awakening of faith has made to later Far Eastern thinkers. To cite an example, the master Kukai, who lived from 774 to 835, the founder of Shingon Buddhism in Japan, made use of this pattern as a basis for systematizing his religious philosophy. Just so happens we're sitting in a Shingon temple tonight, and we have behind me Master Kukai. So this is one of the reasons why this text is fundamental to Shingon, is we're understanding this pattern of analysis that you see here. Just remember this, right? This is just the intro, the beginning. So what you should do this evening is kind of come away with two important points. One mind, two aspects, and we're wrestling with this idea of kind of the spiritual and the profane, or enlightenment and samsara, right? What are these two concepts? So these are just our imaginary mental whiteboard. You've written these things down. That's it. Later on, it'll be filled in underneath, so it's okay. What Asvagosha is pointing at and what is sort of fundamental in Shingon practice is this really important idea that the mind itself has all the ingredients necessary for enlightenment, right? You already have all the tools you need. Everything is already there. You are already whole and complete and on the precipice of enlightenment. But something is obstructing you from seeing it. So in this case, in the awakening of faith perspective, mind is Mahayana. So mind can be viewed as the source or cause of samsara, right, of all of our suffering. And at the same time, it can be the source and cause of nirvana, because it's nowhere outside of ourself. Meaning, when we leave tonight, we can become enlightened, or we can contribute to being stuck in the mud still. It's up to our mind. And the only thing that's going to change that is our mind. So the mind is the cause of both pathways. So if you remember the very beginning, what did he say? He goes, I'm going to lay it all out, then I'm going to give you the practices, and then I'm going to tell you the benefits of those practices. So the practice is, how do we see that? Because clearly, without some practice, we're not getting it. You have it, but you're not getting it. Right? So I'm from Detroit, so of course I have to use a car metaphor. So years ago, the first time I ever drove a Prius, it was a rental, and I sat in the car for 15 minutes trying to figure out how to drive away. Because I had too much pride to go back and ask. Actually, it was longer than that. It was like one of the first early 2000s. I was like, oh, I will figure it out, right? So I had all the skill to drive, and drive well. I had everything I needed. I had keys, the vehicle had fuel, when I could see. I could not start it up and figure out how to put it in drive. It took a very long time to figure that out. I should have read the manual, but I fumbled and finally figured it out. And of course, my impression of the vehicle was like, why? Just, there's nothing wrong with the shifter. Like, why? So I had the first time I encountered a stove that didn't have knobs, but instead had buttons. And you set the temperature, and then nothing would happen, and I set the temperature again, and realizing then you had to hit start or something. Why? Why is it more difficult, right? So I have I had the food, it was all mixed together, it was ready to go, but I couldn't make the heat, right? So in the same way, we have everything we need. It's there already. But there's something obstructing our seeing it for what it is, and so the practice is there to help you unlock that. And that's its purpose. So what Asvagosha is going to do in this text is sort of lay out how it operates, and then tell us the practices we should do. And the practice is supposed to help us finally kind of those last keys to unlock things. Why should we believe him? This is a question he didn't answer. Right? This is a more modern question. Oh yeah? Why should we believe you? Who are you? Right? So the basis of this is this is one of the, I think, benefits of a lineage, is you have a documented history of people who successfully did it before you. Right? Curated life stories and people who pass it down in oral history, actual living tradition of people who were successful. So we can say, they did it, this other person did it, they taught this student, they were successful too. So that's one of the benefits. So to some degree, I would add, as part of the awakening of faith, maybe lineage tradition as a kind of warranty card for why you should do these practices. Why should I do this practice? Or where did you get this? Oh, from the beginning of time, from the Buddha all the way down, this is what we've done, and these people have been successful. all right, okay, I guess I'll give it a try, right? Rather than, I was sitting in my beach house and it just came to me that this is what you should do, trust me. By the way, it's going to cost you $5,000 every time you come to my seminar, right? So there's different models of this. So this is open source. This is free software. This is community use and improvement, right? Like a community garden. There's no one owns it. It's not copyright anyone. So if you read it and study it, you have access to it. You can. You don't need to go on the internet and order a very fancy meditation cushion, right? You can use, like I did, I just went to the linen closet and stole some towels. And like a week later, I could hear my mother, "Where are all the towels?" Crap, I gotta put it back, you know. So you don't need anything fancy. You just read it and do the practice. Go back. Okay. So, Asagosha says, your mind has all the ingredients necessary. And then he gives a definition. The term mind is used neither as the individual mental faculty nor as a mind contrasted with matter. It symbolizes the metaphysical principle as defined in the introduction. When the term mind is thought to be used in this particular sense, the first letter will be capitalized. Some of the synonyms for the mind of sentient being are Tathagatagarbha, the essence of nature of mind, one mind, and he goes on. So he's explaining the method of translation. So I won't read you that. I'll try to explain a little bit more. He breaks down, when he uses the word Mahayana, he's asking us to look at the actual word in Sanskrit. So if we were Sanskrit speakers, we might have more insight into what these mean, but it's helpful to remind us. So Maha means great in Sanskrit. And he says here that it's great because the two aspects encompass all things, enlightenment and samsara, right? So within the mind, you have both of these things. You have these polar opposites, and likewise, the continuum between them. And jnana is vehicle. So the vehicle for differentiating the manifestation of the various results of how the mind works. So this is Mahayana, right? The mind, your mind, produces everything. Your mind can produce enlightenment. It can produce everything that's not enlightenment. And how it functions, the vehicle, jnana, is the insight. So when he's using the term Mahayana, he's looking at the function of how the mind produces any numerous outputs. Right? So this is what he means by Mahayana. So awakening of Mahayana faith is awakening of faith in a practice that you understand your mind. So this gets to, in his footnote 37 that I mentioned earlier, he was pointing to Kukai's text, enlightenment in this very existence, Sokushin Jobutsugi, which if you have Kukai Major Works, I have one of the rare hardcovers. You can read it, right? So he says in there that enlightenment is knowing the mind as it truly is. Right? Knowing how the mind functions, seeing that functioning. This is enlightenment. Because when you attain enlightenment, if we kind of take the example from the Buddha, he didn't forget everything that had come before. He still remembered. So the mind still contained all of those experiences, right? So if you were very, very naughty before you attain enlightenment, you don't forget all of your naughtiness once you're enlightened. So that means your mind still has some quantum of naughty, but you understood the function, right? The jnana side, the vehicle, how it manifests, so that you no longer traverse that pathway, but you haven't forgotten the road. So it's not, again, that you discard something. You don't get rid of anything and you don't get anything. You're already whole and complete. You awaken. This is very different. So the mind has two aspects. The aspect of Tathagata, Buddha, and of samsara, your current position. So one of these we know very well. We know samsara very well. And so the question is, how does the mind change? This is the big question. So this is the purpose of the later chapters, explaining its complete function, and then explaining the actual practices that will help you gain insight into its function. Or in my case, how do you start a Prius and put it in drive without just banging on the steering wheel in frustration? So there's also two other aspects of mind. Mind as individual, right, you personally, and mind generally as like sentient beings' minds, as we're talking. So in the text he's going to distinguish when he's talking about individual or just the general condition of the individual. So here's the interesting thing. Within Buddhist theory, we have these different levels of consciousness. One of them is the alaya consciousness, your storehouse consciousness. So if you, over my right shoulder, on the cinder altar, you'll see the pagoda, so the iron stupa. And at the top, the spires represent the different levels of consciousness. So one of those is the alaya consciousness. And the idea is that it's a complete record of all of your past existences, everything you've done. So modern science is very good at kind of letting us know that memory is not fully understood. Right? We don't have a good understanding scientifically of memory. But when you recall memories, it's, like a high definition video with audio and scent, and it's much more immersive than, a camera is today, right? The camera doesn't catch the instance and the temperature in the room, right? It's limited in that way. So when someone attains enlightenment, they still have this alaya consciousness, they still have all of this past knowledge. So again, that doesn't change, something else changes. So it's not a fundamental kind of wiping of the slate. Right? You've forgotten everything, or you wipe out all the past things. You have complete knowledge. So if you, again, did something that was not beneficial to enlightenment, all the things that you did that led your mind deeper into samsara, that's still there. The knowledge is there anyway. The key is some awakening has happened. So this is one of the key concepts. Which means the mind includes everything, worldly, spiritual, and this is a real basis for Shingon practice. So a lot of our texts are clear that we shouldn't reject things outright. The mind has all of those things. Right? As a human being, you have things that we might think are not helpful for the spiritual path, and other things that may be helpful for the spiritual path. What is obstructing us is constantly making differentiations between them and saying, I'm going to turn away from this and only embrace this, right? We're becoming more rigid. So seeing things more, with more equanimity is part of Shingon practice. It's easy to say, well, there's no distinctions, everything's in my mind, so therefore nothing matters. So once I know this intellectually, whatever I do is a projection of the enlightened mind because I'm enlightened, so I'm going to go have, debauchery, right? Debauchery is enlightenment, So more debauchery, I'll find it in the debauching. Let's all debauch, that's somehow the spiritual practice. And so it's important to point out that that's not what this teaching is saying. It's saying, if we go back up to the skillful means, rupaya, or even when we were studying the Vimalakirti Sutra, Vimalakirti didn't, right? It said Vimalakirti would go to the pleasure house. So he wasn't in the pleasure house tipping over tables saying, like, you're all debauching, stop, right? He comported himself in a manner that everyone else was like, how come he's different, right? So that's the more skillful method. So he didn't turn away from that. He didn't lead the monks and say, let's burn the debauching house down. He went in, he did whatever business he needed to do, right? Maybe it was like a Craigslist deal. So, there's a really good deal on, what would Vimalakirti buy? Bookcases. He's a retired scholar. I need a bookcase. Okay, if you want to buy the bookcase, email me back for it. Please meet me at the strip club. All right, well, if that's where you want to meet. So here comes Vimalakirti in, looking very dignified, and he sits down, and the guy's like watching the show. Vimalakirti is like, so you said $30 for the bookcase? And the guy's like, yeah, aren't you gonna, do you want to drink or anything? No, I just came to get the bookcase. Is there anyone here who can help me load it in my Subaru? We're at Pacific Northwest, so. And Jose, yeah. So they go out to the parking lot, and he goes, I noticed, you're very, you weren't looking at the show inside or anything, and how are you so calm? Why are you like that, man? And he goes, and he gets to talking. So this is more skillful than just like running in saying, you're all debauching, stop the debauchery. This is my imagination for Vimalakirti's, why he's different, in a very Portland story. It bears reminding us that it's more than an intellectual understanding. We'll show the Kukai movie again, but this comes up in the movie also, right? When he's teaching some people and saying, you really need to study and practice. You can't understand this just by reading. There has to be more. It's not strictly an intellectual study. So that's a key component. Okay, so we'll stop there. So we have time for meditation this evening, but before we go to that point, are there any questions? Yes?
Can you explain the language or wording that differentiates the phenomenal mind indicating the essence and the absolute mind representing the essence? Does that make sense?
Oops. I'm scrolling in the wrong. Let's see here. So the
absolute aspect of mind represents the essence, and then the phenomenal aspect indicates the essence.
Yes. So I tried to give a little bit of explanation of the Sanskrit terms, savava. So the first part there, representing its essence, so seeing its own nature, essential nature. So seeing it as it truly is. So if the mind truly is the Buddha nature, right, that would be one side. And then understanding how that same mind manifests. So you have within you the Buddha nature yet, and still your mind, the same mind that will eventually awaken, currently manifests samsara. And then what you need to have insight into are the influences. What is influencing the mind that you manifest right now, samsara? What influences will eventually manifest enlightenment? Right? So it's not rejecting one or the other, it's understanding that the mind is both things, right? So you're just are you on that continuum? What direction are you leaning? So it's very key here, and I think also in Shingon practice, to not reject one and fully embrace the other. You just see them very clearly. You're not destroying one or the other. to get the other one. You just need to see it for what it is. The way my teacher would explain it is in terms of nutrition. So if you cook something today, you go home tonight, you make food, it's fresh, you eat it, and you mistakenly leave a portion on the counter and you have to go away for a week, you come back and that food is no longer, in your consideration, healthy, but it's still nutritious for something. If you put it in your garden, the worms and animals will find that's still nutritious. So in its essence, in many ways, it's nutritious, but how it manifests is based on its influences, right? Proper heat and refrigeration is the influence that continues to keep it nutritious for us. Once it's spoiled, it's no longer nutritious for us, but it still has all the same ingredients. It's the same food. It's just no longer appropriate for us in our position. So in the same way, right? If you're doing practices that aren't suited for you at your level, they're not going to lead towards insight. But if you do practices, right, so the very beginning, shamatha and vipassana, right? If that's where you start, which is calming the mind, then you can be ready for other practices. But if you try to jump into, really detailed deity yoga, day one, it probably won't be beneficial. So this is the kind of beginning. The entire text is discussing these components or these ideas, but he's just kind of laying out, this is the outline of what I'm going to be talking about. That help? Okay. Any other? Yes?
The Kriya.
Yes.
The influences. I've heard Kriya used to...
like Kriya Yoga?
Well, Kriya Yoga also, it's, for lack of a better term, like, some people might, in the presence of enlightenment being, swoon or go into, spontaneous gestures or whatever it might be.
Yes.
Like holy rollers or something,
Yeah.
in a sense. But is that still the same Kriya we're talking about?
It can be. So Kriya here, just as a pure translation, would be influence. So the influence of, a deity, the influence of a practice, or like in Kriya Yoga or Kriya Tantra for other traditions, it could be you're trying to bring specific influences into the mind to change the consciousness. So in this way, it's just the influence. So that's why I think it's helpful here for him to understand it in terms of the discussion of Mahayana. So the mind's two aspects, the yana, the vehicle, and understanding the influence is what's determining whether or not you're enlightened or you're in samsara. So.
Well, I've heard that sometimes when that happens, that's an indication of where that person is stuck, and that manifests itself that way sometimes.
Yeah, that can be the case. I'm trying to think of an example. I've actually seen that where in the presence, most of the ones I've seen are in the presence of like ancestral spirits during memorial services or cemeteries and those kind of things. Well, people will gesticulate and it's the influence of that, the presence of that spiritual presence. So those are the ones I've actually seen. Generally, I think for deities, what's been reported to me or what people tell me is it's often manifested as knowledge or vision. That's not to say that it can't be something else, but at least in my experience, that's what I've seen. Any other? Okay, so we'll go on to...
One of the things is the Mahayana is without there's attributes, but it's the absolute is without that.
Correct. Yeah. And so what he's saying here is the mind has two aspects, one with attributes, one without. So the absolute and then where we currently are. Right? So the enlightened, the unenlightened, the holy and profane, like these two things exist simultaneously. This is why so during all major services we recite the Rishikyo, and the Rishikyo says, pride, lust, passion, all of these things are holy. And it comes from these ideas that it's the same mind. The same mind that manifests enlightenment also manifests pride and lust and passion and, all these different things. So what we have to do is shift our understanding. We don't, throw the mind out. The mind, there may be times when that's necessary, but if you can embrace all of it and see all of it as enlightened activity. Because without those experiences, you're not going to achieve enlightenment, right? Samsara is required to produce enlightenment. So this is why, in a weird way, this is the Pure Land of Shakyamuni Buddha. Right? This is the teaching ground. This is the best education to produce enlightenment for sentient beings.
Yes, it threw me off because the absolute aspect of this mind represents the essence. It's not really an aspect of the mind, is it?
Not really. This is translator speak. So sometimes we have to dig in a little bit more deeply when we have a translator. So I think what he means is, because it's referred to here, the terminology that he's adopted is the mind of two aspects. So one aspect is the enlightened, the other isn't. But in reality, it's the same mind. But in order for Asvagosha to successfully guide us through that understanding and then apply it to practices, he's got to distinguish between the two.